I think we can go on. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second module in our SPRE for Art Spaces series. My name is Alex Glass, and I'm the Executive Director of ArtsBuild Ontario. And in case you haven't heard of us, we're missioned on building up capacity and training and advocacy for art spaces across the province. So we do this through a number of tools, platforms, and research, and of course, this timely project focused on social purpose real estate. And in today's webinar, we will be joined by O-Brien Davis and Rodney Wilts to explore how to identify which space acquisition path best aligns with your creative vision, financial strategy, and community impact. So those are our key focus areas for today. Before we dive in, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So ArtsBuild Ontario acknowledges that our office is located in 44 Gaukel Creative Workspace, which is a settler facility built on the traditional territory of the Attawandarunk, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are located in what is now Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from the source of its mouth. Our mandate is to support arts facilities and creative spaces, but we do not solely define these from a colonial perspective. Creative spaces are not only physical buildings, they are often inclusive of the land itself. So we'll keep that in mind as we move through the topics of the day. And for those of us joining us for the first time in our SPRE, our Social Purpose Real Estate for Art Spaces series, some background on the project. This is a 3-year project that is driven by current challenges, needs, and innovative practices around social purpose real estate with a focus on the art sector. We have a number of activities that are happening over the next few years. We're just wrapping up year 1, which has been a lot of development, and year 2 is just going to be full of lots of resources and more modules like this one today. So in total, we'll be delivering 8 online training modules. We'll have 6 case studies we'll be publishing. First one's coming very soon. And 4 panel discussions. And one of the most exciting pieces, which is a space lab for SPRE projects for arts organizations in partnership with TMU's Creative School. So we'll be focusing on developing that as well this year. And of course, we couldn't do this work without our incredible program partners and advisory committee members, including Toronto Arts Council, City of Toronto, Toronto Metropolitan University, the Infrastructure Institute through U of T School of Cities, OCADU's Cultural Policy Hub, and of course, Creative Collisions. And this project is made possible with support from the Department of Canadian Heritage. Our lead consultant for SPRE for Art Spaces is longtime partner of ABO, Kendra Fry, who will be facilitating the remainder of the session and the Q&A after the presentation. Kendra is a cross-sectoral leader working to enhance the common good through the repurposing of faith in historic spaces, the building of affordable housing, and place-making initiatives to build neighborhoods. With Relevin, she works on churches across Canada, creating art centers, community hubs, food security sites, and housing. With that, Kendra, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Man, that long term made me feel kind of old there for a minute. I was like, wow, long term. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we're really pleased to be here. And thanks for holding space with us today. So, just a quick reminder of Zoom etiquette. I think by this point we all know, but you're probably many of you eating your lunches. Please go ahead and do that. Take breaks. Do what you need to do. You can use the chat to share your insights throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to do that. This should be an open dialogue. But if you have a specific question of any of our presenters, please use the Q&A function so then we can keep track of it. And at the end, we'll do the Q&A. If you need any access support, please use the chat to request support, and an ABO staff member will reach out and help you out. The webinar is being recorded. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And will be posted on ABO's website after, and the slides will be available in both English and French. So our event overview, we're doing some introductions now. Our first presentation today will be Owning and Renting with Theia Partners, and I'll be introducing them in just 1 minute. Our second presentation will be on community land trusts with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. And then we'll finish today with a Q&A. And that will be it for today's session. And we hope that you'll join us for this one and future sessions as well. So first of all, with Theia Partners, I'm going to introduce Rodney Wilts. So we're thrilled to welcome Theia Partners to the second module in the Social Purpose for Arts Space series. As comfortable in a canoe as in a boardroom, Rodney Wilts has dedicated his career to leveraging market solutions to enhancing health, wellness, and sustainability. Rodney started his career as an environmental lawyer, founded Canada's first green building supply centre, and led the master plan of Zibi and endorsed One Planet Community. When not crafting compelling visions for highly innovative mixed-use developments, Rodney can be found with his wife, daughter, and dog, paddling the wilderness rivers in Quebec, or skiing backcountry routes in the fresh powder, which I'm sure he has more than enough of today. Rodney, thanks for joining us. I also want to say Rodney's a great friend and a wonderful resource who I rely on consistently. So welcome, Rodney, and we'll pass over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kendra. Thanks, Alex. Definitely the skiing a lot better than the paddling right about now. Yeah, maybe we can go to the next slide. About Theia Partners, just by way of a very quick introduction, I know I have about half an hour here to talk about arts organizations and strategically using real estate. So I got to move quick here. It's a very high level overview, but what Theia does is we're impact real estate and clean energy developers. We're based in Ottawa. We have quite a bit of experience partnering with nonprofit organizations, including some work that we've done with Relevin over the past couple of years. We are best known for a project called Zibi, which is a 34-acre former factory site about 800 meters upriver from Parliament Hill. We have a zero-carbon district energy system. We have affordable and market housing, apartments and condos, federal office building, parks, plazas, Indigenous partnerships, lots going on there. If you're ever in Ottawa, we love to show it off. So that's by way of introduction to Theia. I've been doing impact real estate for about 20 years. Talk about feeling a little bit old, eh, Kendra? All right, so next slide. So by way of agenda, we're going to talk about the spectrum of partnerships. There's a whole host of different ways that arts organizations end up partnering with asset managers and real estate developers. We're going to talk about owning and renting, pros and cons. We're going to talk a little bit about partnerships with developers and arts organizations. Monetizing your property. I have a couple of joint venture case studies with nonprofits. And then finally, I'll have some things to watch out for if you're going to be thinking about partnering for your real estate. And then at the very end, we'll be taking questions, and feel free to put things in the chat, of course, too. I know Kendra's going to be paying attention to that. So next slide. And we'll go one further here. So when we think about arts organizations and real estate, there's a whole host of different ways. I describe it as this kind of spectrum of ways that arts organizations are in one way or another kind of partnered with an asset manager or a developer. The most common is just the tenant relationship. An arts group leases space from a developer, hopefully because you're organizations that are helping make our communities better places. Hopefully you're getting a good deal, but that's the easiest and simplest way. The next one on the chain is a value add tenant. Same as above, but the tenants are engaged in arts activities to offset rent. And I know, in some cases, thinking about organizations like Artscape and such that have been able to craft favorable arrangements where they're helping animate space, they're helping bring life to a building or a community. A keystone tenant is even one step further, and I'm going to use an example of that ultimately later on in the presentation. So a key tenant who ultimately is able to enable a project and receives even more favorable treatment. The next stop along that spectrum is a joint venture partner. So an arts group in that case has access to land, which they leverage to enable development in return for a revenue stream or space in the development project at the end. And then finally, is this developer for hire, where ultimately the arts organization is really the full driver and the full owner of the project, but ultimately hires a developer as a consultant. So there's this whole kind of spectrum in terms of how developers and arts groups engage with each other. Next slide. So owning versus renting, this is a kind of classic question, not just on the residential side, but for arts organizations, sort of saying, should I be owning my real estate or should I be renting my real estate? And there's really a whole host of pros and cons on either side. If you own your real estate, you have more control of the site. No, I'm going to talk about an example where an arts organization was an owner of a building, but within a condominium. And so, you have to note any condominium restrictions that may exist. If you own a site, generally you have more secure tenure. Nobody's going to be able to throw you out. As long as you're paying your bills, you're able to stay there much longer. You can benefit from appreciation. So, lots of arts organizations have done really well acquiring space in sometimes in neighborhoods or areas that aren't that desirable, and then because the artists are in those spaces, that it actually starts becoming more and more favorable neighborhoods, and they drive that kind of appreciation. But there are also cons, right? So there's less flexibility, so it's harder to add or lose space. So if you own a space that's 10,000 or 100,000 square feet, it's much more challenging to sort of say, oh, we've got a successful grant and we need 25% more space, or actually, times are a little leaner. We'd love to be 25 or 50% smaller. So there is a flexibility trade-off. There's certainly higher risk anytime you sign on to a loan. You have to make those loan payments. If you don't, you can get foreclosed on, and certainly increased responsibilities. That's one of these things that I've heard from nonprofits and charities, that real estate is an asset and a liability, and it's a liability in some respects because you have responsibilities to be dealing with the roof and the snow clearing and liability of people visiting the space, etc. So renting, it's kind of the flip side of it. There's more flexibility to move, grow, shrink. You're not locked in as much in terms of changing and growing your space. The landlord should be responsible for major building systems. So, instead of the arts group having to learn about all the intricacies of mechanical systems, as for instance, that's your landlord's responsibility. It does limit the downside risk in terms of foreclosures and those sorts of things, but you have less security of tenure and no possibility of appreciation. So there are these pros and cons in terms of owning versus renting, and figuring out what's right for your organization is important for sure. Next slide. So, and then even if we think about, own versus rent, there's a whole host, and we're just going to touch on these because of our time constraints today at noon. But if we think ownership, there are different models about what ownership can look like. So there can be a direct ownership, a simple owning a building outright. There can be ownership within a condominium. I didn't even have that piece listed. You can own within a partnership. So it can be a joint venture. We're partnered right now with a nonprofit on a development project where we're effectively 50-50 joint venture partners. You can own in a co-op. I'm going to leave land trust aside because I know Jane is going to do a much better job talking about that shortly. A lease, there can be a whole host of different ways to lease a property. So, the traditional lease, that's the most simple. Here's our monthly lease rate, but it can also be lease to own. It can be a ground lease where the landlord owns the land, but the organization, the arts group, owns the building. And sorry, I'm not sure. I've a little slide mix up there, but you know, just to say those are different ways that a lease can do. And then different ways to finance a development project or a real estate project. So, you know, certainly grants, we're seeing a lot more crowdfunding these days, even for real estate projects now. Previously, crowdfunding for real estate investment projects wasn't allowed in Canada. And as of a few years ago, it is now available, and there's a number of platforms that are doing that work. Community bonds, there's an organization based in Toronto called Tapestry that's been working with a number of arts organizations helping raise community bonds, sometimes for real estate, and impact investors. So investors who want a return on their money, but also want to create social good. That was something where 20 years ago was almost unheard of when I started in the real estate space. And now increasingly we're seeing that becoming commonplace, where people sort of say, yeah, I want to place my money. I'd like to make a modest return, but I'd love it for it to do social good as well. Next slide. So, you know, one of the questions we get in terms of our arts groups thinking about some kind of partnership with a developer is, are all developers the same? And just like all arts organizations are different, so are all developers. And if you're thinking about some kind of partnership, if you're thinking about leveraging your property for a joint venture partnership or a value add, even a value add tenancy, you know, it's important, I always think, to start with values alignment first. So the reality, unfortunately, is I use the joke is I started my career as a lawyer, and I wasn't unpopular enough, so I became a real estate developer. And there's a reason that real estate developers have a bit of a bad reputation. There's lots of shady operators. I always say, look at what a developer has done, not just what they say. Every developer will tell you, I'm keen and interested in sustainability. I'm keen and interested in community development. I'm keen and interested in fostering the arts and partnerships that create community benefits. But if you look at the track record, you know, there's a lot fewer that actually deliver on that piece. And one of the things I always say in terms of real estate partnerships, you know, in some ways it's like a marriage. Especially if there's a development partnership, it's a long-term partnership, and you have to ensure that those values align as a starting point. Next slide. So one of the things I was asked to cover was monetization. There are many arts groups who actually own their real estate outright, and have experienced that real estate more as a liability than as an asset necessarily, right? It's expensive to maintain, and thinking about, you know, are there ways that I could more strategically use my real estate, leverage my real estate? And Kendra's doing that work with a lot of faith-based organizations across the country. But there's lots of arts groups that are trying to think in that same way. And so there's a host of different options in terms of ways to potentially monetize your real estate. So the one, and maybe the simplest one, is to act as a landlord. So making sure your space is fully optimized. Is it being used 7 days a week? Is it being used mornings and evenings? And that's the kind of work that's being done in a lot of spaces to kind of create community hubs and finding like-minded organizations or complementary organizations that can help optimize that space, sometimes in the off times where the arts organization isn't using it or the community organization is not using it. Of course, another way to monetize the site is an outright sale. Now, I always think that this is a kind of one-time injection of funds, but in terms of options on the table to monetize for arts groups that own real estate and want to turn that liability into an asset. Another, and I'm going to talk about some case studies here, is a joint venture. So partnering with a developer to bring a development project to life that can help create a revenue stream associated with it. And then option 4 is for arts groups that own their own real estate, is actually to look to develop that real estate. You know, that I caution people that that's a high risk endeavor, and it certainly requires a degree of sophistication and experience that isn't necessarily common in a lot of arts organizations. So that one comes in a caution, but it is an option on the table. Next slide. So if you're thinking about ever doing a development project, it's important to have something called a pro forma. And people may have heard this term before, but may not be familiar with what it is, what actually a pro forma is. So a pro forma simply is a projection of expenses and revenues that's a key decision-making tool for any real estate projects. So it's sort of saying, here are all the costs that we think we're going to have with this real estate project, and here are all the revenues that we're going to have associated with that project, and do we make sure that we have at least as much in the way of revenues as we do costs. Ideally, we have a little more revenue than we have costs at the end of the day. A pro forma is forward looking, so it's a tool being used as we're engaging in a development project or in a real estate project of any kind. It makes assumptions, and so one of the challenging things is if you're looking at a project that may require a rezoning or a site plan, or may even require a long fit up. You're buying an old factory building and you want to fit it up, and you're going to have to be applying for permits and all of those kinds of things, and it's going to be measured in a couple of years. Is those assumptions can change. Interest rates can go up and down. Construction costs can go up and down. So it's only as good a tool as those assumptions hold steady, but it is a really, really kind of important and critical tool to make smart decisions as it comes to real estate projects. One of the other things about a pro forma is the more sophisticated a pro forma is, the more formulas it has in terms of projecting. Do you have a project that pencils? Do you have a project that makes economic sense and is viable? And if one of those formulas is off, the entire pro forma may be useless. So these are one of these things that's, double checking assumptions, double checking the information you have in the pro forma, and double checking those formulas is really key. For us, a pro forma is a living document that should be updated, revised, and consulted as project information changes. So we're living in a really dynamic environment right now, for better or for worse, where things are changing really rapidly. Construction pricing and interest rates and development charges, all of these things are changing in real time. And so making sure that that document stays live with the best information you have at any given time is really critical. Next slide. So I have a couple of joint venture case studies I'm going to talk about where we've partnered with nonprofit groups who have looked to leverage their real estate to better support their social purpose. And I think they may be illustrated for you. So next slide. The first project is a project with a faith-based organization, but they're a nonprofit and a charity. And in this case, it was a Unitarian congregation. And the Unitarian congregation in Ottawa had a fairly significant vacant parking lot. And like a lot of faith-based groups, were running modest but consistent deficits. And so there was a real desire to leverage this property to do a number of things. One was to deliver on affordable housing. We're in a housing crisis, and they wanted to do something positive in that direction. They wanted to make a tangible step towards Indigenous reconciliation. That was a really important part for the congregation. And they wanted to create a revenue stream. So they wanted to fix their structural deficit and be in a position where they were positive cash flow every year. So those were their desires. The process has taken over a decade. We successfully got the property rezoned last fall. So we've been working in a 50-50 joint venture with the church to redevelop that parking lot to deliver on that affordable housing. Next slide. I think I have one more slide on this one. Oh, yeah. So in terms of the process, first you determine the objectives, which was around affordable housing, revenue, and Indigenous reconciliation. They started with a trusted consultant, which in this case was an organization called CCOC, which works on affordable housing. They were referred to a developer partner who was us. And what we ended up coming up with was a 2-building concept And that two building concept, one was a 16-story building, which is designed to create a revenue stream for the church. At the time of occupancy, it'll create about $400,000 a year for the church to help sustain them long term. And that amount gets a little better every year. And the smaller building, a 6-story building, is an Indigenous nonprofit building with an organization called Ontario Aboriginal Housing. So pre-development, there was a congregational vote. I suspect, in many of your cases, you would require a board vote or a member vote. It required creating a full collection of legals, hundreds of pages of legal documents, many board meetings, a rezoning, which we were successful last fall, a site plan, which we're working through now, and that site plan should be submitted in hopefully mid-March, and construction to start end of this year. So it's a long process to get here. There's amazing what it can deliver on, but it doesn't happen quickly. Next slide. So here you can just see on the left of that photo, you can see the 16-story building and the 6-story building on the right. And so at the end of the day, it's delivering on affordable housing. It's delivering on creating a tangible step towards reconciliation and a pretty significant long-term revenue stream. In this case, a partnership with the developer who's provided, that's us, who's provided the cash. The nonprofit in this case had the land, but not much in the way of any surplus money or cash, and the expertise, and the developer ultimately taking on the risk of the loan and the construction risk. Go to the next slide. Here's another example. This was a project I worked on with my previous company. I was a partner in a company called Windmill Developments before Theia. And with Windmill Developments, we partnered with the Great Canadian Theatre Company. And this was a condominium building in Ottawa. It was LEED Platinum, which is the highest rating you can get under the LEED rating system, which is for sustainable buildings. It had a large solar wall. That's what you see in the middle of the building. And in this case, the Great Canadian Theatre Company really wanted to update their space. They wanted to own new space that was custom crafted for them. So we were able to do that with them being the ground floor of a condominium project. And so the ground floor is the theater, a cafe, a lobby, rehearsal space, change rooms, those sorts of things. The City of Ottawa was a contributor, many private donors. The arts group really helped create community buy-in. So for us as developers, that was a key piece in terms of going to the community and saying we could create a community benefit, not just on the housing side, but also creating a real community institution. And the Great Canadian Theatre Company has been a major part, a major catalyzer of neighborhood vibrancy there. There has been some friction points, I think, with being part of the condominium and some shared lobby and loading space, but I think overall it's worked out really well for everyone. Next slide. So what to watch out for if you're thinking about doing a partnership of some fashion with the developer, or seeking to leverage your real estate for broader gain. So next slide. One of the things to watch out for is timing. We've heard from nonprofits, oftentimes when we hear from nonprofits, and we have a long experience working with them, is they wait till they're in a real financial crisis and sort of say, boy, I'd love to leverage my real estate to help get me out of this jam. And the timing doesn't work because they'll run out of cash long before they can actually fully optimize their real estate. So development takes forever. And with arts organizations, with nonprofits, with charitable organizations, there's oftentimes very slow decision making as well in terms of engagement with members and boards. Oftentimes, I think partnerships can go wrong. I talked about the values, that there can be values misalignment between nonprofit organizations and developers. Or in some cases, the values are aligned, but the developer partner chosen by a nonprofit lacks the capacity to deliver. So in some cases, I've seen, groups partner up with a very small or just nascent development organization who who cares a lot about community, cares a lot about sustainability, cares a lot about the arts, but actually doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the financial capacity, doesn't have the staff to be able to deliver. And then expectations. I oftentimes, when we get into early conversations, there can be expectations that development will fix everything, and so these expectations can be sky high about what somebody's property might be worth, or what kind of cash flow it can create, or expectations around what might be possible in and around sustainability or design, those sorts of things. So these are all things to kind of watch out for. Next slide. So that's my bit of a whirlwind introduction to thinking about real estate and development and owning versus renting. I'm going to hang around, and I'm looking forward to catching Jane's presentation, but we'll be here to answer any questions that people may have.
Thanks so much, Rodney. Very helpful. ArtsBuild, you stopped my video, so I can't turn it back on, but I'm here. It's Kendra. Um, I really appreciate the perspective you bring, and I know that you've worked a lot with not-for-profits in various ways, and so that's a really great depth of experience that you bring, and I look forward to taking some questions at the end as well. We're going to switch modes right now, and we're going to go over to Jane O-Brien Davis. So, Jane O-Brien Davis is a community land trust specialist with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. She's a background in urban planning and critical geography. With the network, Jane supports the development of resources for organizational capacity building, facilitates knowledge mobilization, leads community engagement, and provides technical assistance for community land trusts throughout Canada. As part of her role, Jane promotes the growth and development of BIPOC-led community land trusts. Jane holds a BA in Urban Studies from McGill University and an MSc in Planning from the University of Toronto. Jane, I got to tell you, in my recent housing work, I am developing an advanced understanding of the complexities of planning and the ways in which it interplays in our world. So I appreciate even more people who have taken on the MSc in Planning and bring that knowledge to the table on behalf of not-for-profits in a way that allows us to be equivalent players at the table and help to control the means of production, as it were. The floor is yours, Jane. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kendra. Can you all see my screen properly? Everything looks good?
Yep, we're
Okay,
good.
awesome. Well, hi everyone. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to ArtsBuild for inviting me to speak with you. So I'm going to deliver what we call the network, the CLT 101 presentation. So it's basically just what a CLT is, how it works, and how it can be used in your context and your community. So before I do that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the network solidarity with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So personally, I'm calling in here from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. However, CNCLT is a nationwide network. We engage in work across Turtle Island. So we recognize that we engage in land-based work on the ancestral territories of First Nations folks, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So, because of that, we are committed to supporting Indigenous sovereignty and well-being, and we do so through three tangible actions: supporting the development and growth of Indigenous-led CLTs, sharing best practices for supporting reconciliation, decolonization, and land back through CLTs, as well as sharing resources to support non-Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous CLTs in their solidarity efforts. Many of these resources that we've developed are available on our website. So now this is just a quick outline of what I'll go over today. Quickly, I'll talk about the history, the origins and evolutions of community land trusts, what the community land trust sector looks like here in Canada, what is a community land trust, and then we'll kind of ground that in some examples of arts-based organizations engaging with CLTs. So before I jump into that, I'm just going to quickly talk about what CNCLT is. So the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts is a convening place for CLTs and allied organizations across the country. So we're a member-based organization, and we support the growth of CLTs throughout the country with the primary purpose of acquiring, developing, or stewarding permanently affordable housing, land, and other assets that contribute to a thriving community. We envision a CLT sector that's well connected and enabled by government funding and policy. And we kind of do all of that through five major guiding principles. You can see them here. Housing is a right, not a commodity. Land ownership empowers communities. Solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Democratic governance. And lastly, diversity. The priorities that we have in our work are knowledge mobilization. That's a big one, just doing this presentation and trying to get people to understand what a CLT is and if it works for them and how it can work for them. We provide technical assistance, so that's resource development, technical webinars, community engagement, governance design, and we also support movement building and advocacy. So, the origins and evolutions of the community land trust movement. So, it all started in 1969 when a collective of Black civil rights activists established New Communities, Inc., which would go on to become the first community land trust. And this was in rural southwestern Georgia. So, this was a collective response to the ongoing displacements faced by Black farmers, by white landowners in the region. This displacement was largely retaliatory as Black farmers were, registering to vote for the first time since gaining the right to in America. So they came together and they envisioned a plot of land that would enable them to provide farmland access and housing for Black farmers and community members in the region. So what they established was the first community land trust. It was 5,000 acres of land. It's still around today. And at the time, it was said to be the biggest tract of land owned by Black Americans. Since then, CLTs have been adapted across the world in both rural and urban contexts. But what I like about this story and what's interesting to note, and what I always try to underscore for folks, is that while new communities did end up developing affordable housing solutions on this land, what they created was not at the base, a model for affordable housing provision, but actually a model for collective land ownership. And affordable housing was one of the potential uses that they saw for this land. Another one was agriculture, right? So it just kind of underscores that the CLT model has always been flexible, has always been meant to meet the needs of whichever community. So as I mentioned, while the model has rural roots, it began to kind of start resonating with more urban communities in the 1980s. So that's kind of where our story here in Canada starts. So the first CLTs in this country, what we call the first generation, started popping up between the 1980s and the 2000s. This generation was characterized by sector-led projects and were in response to the need to secure affordable housing assets amidst Canada's divestment from cooperative housing, as well as other major redevelopment projects that displaced tenants. So some projects that arise during that time that are still around today are CoLandCo, or the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto, Communauté Milton Park, which is a land trust here in Montreal. And in the late 90s, we saw the Community Land Trust of BC, which kind of is active in and around the Vancouver area. More recently, we've seen kind of the second generation of CLTs in Canada start. And this is from 2012 to present. And it is characterized largely by the grassroots origins of these organizations. So this wave of CLTs arise in response to gentrification, escalating land prices, and a need to secure community housing assets. So some notable examples are Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto, or Kensington Market Community Land Trust in Toronto as well, or also the Hogan's Alley Society in Vancouver, BC, popped up during this time. And it was during this phase that CNCLT was founded in 2017. Um, so this generation of community land trust has really seen an increased public sector support through capacity building grants, and this is largely a result of advocacy from within the sector. So now we're in what we call a CLT renaissance. So we have overactive CLT, over 40 active CLTs throughout the country. This means we're at close to 10,000 homes being stewarded by community land trusts and over 2,500 members of community land trusts. And also more recently, we've been seeing the CLT model go back to its roots again and be used in various contexts as a vehicle for racial justice and anti-displacement. So in Nova Scotia on the East Coast, we're seeing African Nova Scotian communities really be the leader in the sector out there and having CLTs be used to secure historic land tenure. We're seeing Black communities in urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver use the CLT model to combat displacement caused by urban renewal. We're seeing Chinatowns using the CLT model to combat gentrification, and Indigenous communities kind of across Turtle Island using the CLT model to enact land back or rematriation. But all that said, what is a community land trust? So at its core, a community land trust, a CLT, is a model of collective land stewardship, which enables permanent affordability and community wealth building. So in Canada, CLTs are there's no legislation that defines a CLT. They're not legal concepts, but rather an ideology of land tenure that can be adapted to diverse community contexts and land uses. So since CLTs aren't legally defined, the model is very flexible, and that's one of the benefits. It can be adapted to fit the needs of different communities and different contexts for different land uses, as I mentioned, but generally, this is not in all cases, but in most. Generally, these are kind of the characteristics that apply to most CLTs and how we understand them. So firstly, permanent land stewardship. CLTs never sell their land. Community land trusts never sell the land, therefore protecting it from the speculative real estate market. Perpetual affordability. Housing or other properties, other assets owned by the CLTs are affordable forever. Growth-oriented. CLTs assemble community-owned real estate portfolios with active acquisition and development pipelines. Place-based. CLTs serve a certain geography from, specific neighborhoods to entire regions. Community-led. CLTs have a membership and an elected board that includes both residents of the CLT as well as other community members, and for community benefit. So CLTs directly benefit the community by enabling them to access, land to support whatever the identified need is in the community. Often CLTs also play an important role in advocacy and community building. So, as I mentioned, CLTs have, a variety of land uses. It can be used in a variety of ways. It's most often or most notably used for affordable housing provision. So that could include rental, cooperative housing, rent-to-own options, home ownership. But more recently, we've seen kind of a proliferation of land trusts being used for cultural and community spaces, as well as commercial uses and agricultural uses. And that's, as I mentioned, one of the great things about the CLT model is that it owns the land, but the land use is dictated by a multi-stakeholder board. Like it's dictated by community governance, allowing for it to respond to the needs of the community and change and adapt as those needs change and adapt. So, as I mentioned, CLTs are forever affordable. They're committed to perpetual affordability. So the housing, commercial, community, cultural spaces that are owned by a CLT must remain affordable forever and accessible to the community that it aims to serve. CLTs do not seek to make a profit off of land sales or rental income, so any surplus revenue is reinvested into the mission. So whether that's, supporting capital repairs, acquiring more property, any kind of programming or operational funding needed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what community governance looks like, how a CLT is governed. So this is what we would call the classic or the traditional CLT governance structure, where the membership is made up of both the people who live on and use the CLT land and those in the broader community or the broader city. And the members elect and run for the board. And the board has allocated seats. So 1/3 of the seats for core members, those who live on or use the CLT land, 1/3 for community members, so just other folks in the identified service area of the CLT, and 1/3 for public representatives, organizational representatives, etc. People with a vested interest. Um, this exact structure, however, is actually quite rarely used among CLTs in Canada. But these basic ideas of an open membership and key stakeholder representation are pretty consistent. So most CLTs, take this structure and adapt it to their context. Taking elements and mixing and matching to make it make sense for their community. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about typical funding, CLT funding structures. How are people acquiring property? Where is the operational money coming from? Where's the programming money coming from, etc. So throughout the following slides, a caveat is kind of that these pathways to acquisition and funding structures are often based on housing-focused CLTs, mostly because those are currently the leaders in the sector. However, I've included them to kind of demonstrate what is possible and underscore that some of these funding opportunities are the direct result of advocacy on the part of the CLT. So, from startup to stewardship. Like other nonprofits, new CLTs require startup funding. So that often looks like grants, either public sector, foundational, or donations. Once we're at the development acquisition stage, municipal concessions, for example, waiving development fees or land donations, are somewhat common. We also see some other funding streams such as community bonds, traditional financing, and then once we get to long-term stewardship, we see kind of lease fees and rent subsidies come into play. But, as CLTs acquire assets, they're also able to generate revenue through building sales, membership dues, et cetera, et cetera. So pathways to land acquisition. So these are kind of like what we typically see: purchase at market value, purchase below market from government. So often, we have examples, for example, both Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and Circle Community Land Trust in Toronto have seen former social housing units be purchased below market rate from the city. Sometimes we have generous private owners who are willing to do this as well. We have surplus lands from the government, sometimes received as a gift to CLTs, or private owners as well, feeling generous and donating their properties or bequesting them through wills. We see CLTs acquire property through transfers from inclusionary zoning, community benefits agreements, or land title claims. So this next slide here is just kind of some of the public acquisition funding programs that are available. As I mentioned, these are all kind of specific to housing projects, but I included them just to kind of demonstrate what is possible. As I mentioned, for example, in the city of Toronto, the multi-unit residential acquisition program is a direct result of advocacy on behalf of the CLT sector, specifically Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and Kensington Market Community Land Trust, really advocated for this program to be created. So often to complement public funding, as it's often just for housing, CLTs will use non-public funding options. This is very common for CLTs focused on commercial as well as residential, or if they have a mixed-use portfolio. As they receive public acquisition funding, and that covers the residential portion of the property, but the rest of the property needs to be paid for otherwise. So we see lines of credit come into play here. We see traditional mortgages, donations, and grants. And more recently, we're seeing community bonds. So I can talk about that a little bit more in detail, but essentially, community bonds are a social finance tool that enables community members to invest in projects that deliver a social good. Um, Tapestry, as was mentioned before, is kind of a leader in the sector in terms of working with CLTs to support community bond campaigns. Those who purchase a community bond are paid back according to specific terms that are set by the organization. Some CLTs, including Ottawa Community Land Trust and Kensington Market Community Land Trust, have issued community bonds to provide flexible financing for acquisition projects. And that right there is the draw to them. The benefit of the community bond, opposed to other financing sources, is that the funds can be deployed quickly and flexibly. This kind of allows the CLT to compete on like in the fast-paced real estate market. So how do you protect your assets once you get the funding, once you secure the asset? How is it protected? So there are various strategies used here by CLTs. Again, CLTs are not trusts in the legal sense. They are nonprofit organizations. So their goal is to ensure that the CLT retains permanent ownership and that those assets are forever affordable. So to do this, the CLT can apply a variety of policies or legal tools to secure their asset and their organization, but most commonly, with our members, we see folks, ensuring affordability because the majority of our members are affordable rental housing providers. And they ensure affordability due to parameters set by or they protect their assets and ensure affordability due to parameters set by the funders that require, 99 year, um, 99-year affordability terms in terms of, the rents they provide, or we see organizational bylaw restrictions that kind of outline how the mission in the organization is to be carried out and who the intended residents are, what the affordability terms are, etc. So now I have a few examples to kind of ground what I was just speaking about, proof of concept. So first we'll start in Vancouver. So since 2018, 221A has been in the process of incubating what they're calling the Cultural Land Trust. So 221A, for those of you who don't know, is an artist-run center in Vancouver. They were founded in 2005 as a student-led initiative, and they work with artists and designers to research, develop social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure. Most of their work has been shaped by the history and gentrification of Vancouver's Chinatown, which is the neighborhood in which they're located. They own and operate several buildings throughout Vancouver where they provide artist housing, studio space, and co-working spaces. And the CLT, the Cultural Land Trust, is a collective response to the escalating real estate prices that have placed severe pressure on the security of tenure for artists and arts organizations in downtown Vancouver. So as I mentioned, since 2018, they've been working on the Cultural Land Trust. At this stage, they've been just supporting, planning the startup of the CLT with the goal of the Cultural Land Trust to increase the long-term security for artists in the sector. Right now, the CLT is still a pen and paper organization, but in 2024, 221A concluded the business planning phase, and they're now actively seeking $15 million in seed funding to support the acquisition. Their current goal is to secure 30 properties in British Columbia by 2050. Next, we have the Creative Land Trust, which is in London, UK. Um, so this was founded pretty recently. They've had like a lot of movement in the past even 5 years. They were founded in 2020 specifically to combat the loss of affordable workspace and the outflow of artists in London. They work to sustain arts and culture spaces, and specifically for them, this is artist studios through the purchase of freeholds or long leases. They also have many gifts and asset transfers they've received. So they've been able to use local agreements and community infrastructure levies or community benefits agreements to enable long-term affordability. And currently, they own and have retrofitted one historic building and have acquired space in two upcoming mixed-use developments. The image above, or the image you might see here, is of the Alice Billing House in London. It was previously owned by the municipal government and stood vacant for 10 years. It was acquired by the Creative Land Trust and is currently being refurbished. As of June 2024, they were able to open the southern block of the building, and they're currently providing 25 studios for local artists. And this building itself will eventually provide studios, up to 40 studios. And lastly, here we have the Community and Cultural Spaces Trust in Toronto. So, CCST, the Community and Cultural Spaces Trust, was born out of a historic community benefit settlement that resulted from a development that displaced a central community cultural hub in the Bloor Dufferin neighborhood in Toronto. This settlement was the result of years of organizing by a local mutual aid organization called Build a Better Bloor Dufferin. The settlement was 17 million in total, but two of which was specifically set aside for local cultural spaces. So that's where CCST comes in. In 2022, CCST was created to kind of steward these funds. They aim to eventually provide sustainable, affordable spaces for community and cultural uses using these funds. And they've yet to make an acquisition, but they're currently doing outreach and engagement work as well as developing a business plan so that they can become acquisition ready. So yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now.
Thanks so much, Jane. I really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge and taking on us on that whistle stop tour. It looks to me like the cultural land trusts are kind of just coming into their own and like they're starting to occupy equal position with the housing land trusts. Is that kind of what you're seeing now?
Yes, for sure. We're really seeing them start to pop up very recently, like past 5 years even. I think something that's interesting is that we at the network we have different communities of practice that kind of inform the direction of our resources. Often one has been housing, but recently we've been hearing from folks from across the country coming to us with issues of displacement in the arts and culture sector and using the CLT model as a way to kind of address that. So I'm
Mhm.
really, excited to see what the next years, have in store for arts and culture sector because I think the model is very replicable in these contexts and it's very exciting.
And potentially there's opportunity to bring together housing and art space. It's not uncommon, as you would know, with your zoning background to have a residential zone that requires commercial on the main floor, which weirdly,
Exactly.
theaters and dance studios and such meet the standard of commercial on the main floor, although we don't see ourselves
Mhm.
that way, perhaps.
Exactly. No, it happens all the time. Like Little Jamaica Community Land Trust in Toronto is, in talks with cultural organizations, go in on it together and things like that. These discussions are definitely taking place and it's a very exciting time. And we hear all the time from different galleries, museums about their kind of, their fears of displacement and how they could kind of use the CLT model to address that, which is exciting. Exciting time for innovation.
Amazing. Rodney, if you want to turn your camera on too, we're just going to do a bit of Q&A. So people are more than welcome to pop questions into the Q&A box, and Ava will bring my attention to those. I think we have a couple in there already. So we had a question for Rodney from Demetra. Are you able to share an ideal tenancy agreement that would benefit tenant arts organizations? And specifically for key tenancy was the question.
Uh, I don't have an agreement right at my fingertips here in terms of sharing something, but certainly I can recall at ZB we were in discussions with an arts organization in terms of having a significant arts organization. It didn't come together at the very last minute because of their own resourcing issues, but in terms of we had some available commercial space, and we were going to make that available to them effectively for nearly free. They would be covering the operating costs, but as part of that, for a significant development project like that, we had obligations for community art, and so they were going to help us do the procurement process for community art. So that's just one example of the kind of creative kind of tenancy arrangements that are going on out there. So I'd be happy to chat in more detail, but I know there's lots of examples out there in terms of people thinking creatively about how do you create a mutual win.
Yeah, I'd agree. And talking about ideal tenancy agreements implies that all arts organizations are the same as well. So I think that there's a customization element to that, in which there are elements one wants to consider within one owns framework. But ideal is relative to, the question I'm consistently asking myself is, what is it my organization wants right now? What does it want 10 years from now? And what is it willing to trade to get there, right? I mean, everything's a negotiation.
Absolutely. Yeah, great points.
Rodney, I know the answer to this, but I will ask you anyways. Have you worked with Indigenous developers, architects, and engineers on any of your projects?
Yeah, we have, and the project I referenced as the first case study was it's an amazing organization. They're called Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. They're an Indigenous owned ran organization that focuses on providing off reserve affordable housing. So we're partnered with them on that two building development project right now. Um, there's growing movement around how do you leverage development, and it's a tricky line. Like, how do you leverage development? We all recognize Canada's shameful history with First Nations, and we started today with the land acknowledgement. And so how do we, within the kind of colonial construct that we're in, how do we leverage development to try and make tangible steps towards reconciliation? And so, we have done community benefits agreements in the past, voluntary community benefits agreements that were around Indigenous art, around naming protocols, around employment opportunities. So those are some of the things we've done. And I will give a shout out to Ontario Aboriginal Housing. There are a number of Indigenous architecture firms that are across Canada. A quick Google search will be your friend there. I want to be careful not to give a shout out to one or the other here, but there are a number of organizations out there that are doing good work on that front.
Thanks, Rodney. Yeah, I think you're right. There are a number of Indigenous architect and engineering firms I've been working with as well, particularly around historic sites, and the growing methodologies around deconstruction rather than demolition when constructing new sites has been interesting too, and the ways in which those have connected with Indigenous learnings and seven generation approaches. So. Can you point to an example where a development of cultural space does not, I'm assuming this says does not meet expected revenue generation? Can you point to an example where a development of cultural space that does not expect revenue generation? Andrew, I'm going to ask you to clarify that question a little bit more, and I'm going to go on to a different one. Jane, can you talk about the route that the CCST Bloor Dufferin took to being awarded that settlement? I know there's some funkiness in there, but go for it.
For sure. So CPST is actually an organization that the members of Build a Better Bloor Dufferin developed to accept the settlement. So Build a Better Bloor Dufferin was a local mutual aid organization that really did a lot of organizing around the loss of this cultural space as a result of the development of Bloor and Dufferin. And they were able to negotiate and able to organize towards the historic CBA, Community Benefits Agreement, and settlement that the developer paid $17 million. So they worked with a housing partner, and that housing partner accepted $15 million to provide affordable housing, and they created CCST, so that organization was incorporated to accept the $2 million settlement to specifically acquire a new community cultural space in the neighborhood. So it wasn't a direct route. It was like years of organizing and all of these things. And this is often the story we hear in community land trust. It's often, a very labor intensive process. But I'm sure if you go on their website or if you reach out to me, I can get you in contact with them and they can, provide you with more detail. But it was not kind of a linear thing. It was lots of organizing, lots of paperwork, lots of like years of work essentially. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's helpful. Rodney, when organizations are purchasing a building, are there some common mistakes they make? And I know there are some documents that you and I have talked about that it's good to have in hand before you think about purchasing a building. Can you talk a little bit about the available formats in which one can learn about a building and be careful about what you buy?
Yeah, great. These are big questions, Kendra.
Just a small thing, Rodney.
I
Just tell us how to be
I
safe.
I always this is one of my other kind of little jokes. It's like I always say I started my career as a lawyer, but I wasn't a real lawyer. I was doing nonprofit public interest environmental law. So you should make sure you have a good lawyer.
Yes.
I'll put that proviso on there. There's a thousand things you should look out for. There's no question on that front. I mean, one of course is getting a good report done on the building condition it's called a building condition assessment report, but effectively an inspection, sort of saying, okay, those fundamental systems, mechanical systems, roof, windows, what kind of shape are they in? When are you expecting that they would need to be replaced? What's the lifespan left on them? Heritage protection, those are one of those things where a property might be on a heritage watch list, maybe heritage designated. Those are two different things, but they bring with them some degrees of protection and may have impacts on the vision in terms of what you may want to do. Zoning is huge. This is one of
Yep.
these things that oftentimes people think, great, that's a perfect building for me to, have my dance troupe and host shows and what have you. Is the zoning going to allow you to do the things you want to do? It's expensive to change that zoning. It's time consuming, and ultimately you may strike out. Contamination issues. So, again, with some of the buildings that are attractive to arts groups are old factory sites, those kinds of things. Well, you may be inheriting a contaminant, and you may be willing to live with that contaminant, but it might be contaminating adjacent sites, and you might find yourself in the chain of liability on those kinds of things. So those are some of the things that you need to be looking out for when you're looking at a new site. And I would say too, actually, that most cities, there are some pretty good brokers around, sometimes who will work on a discounted basis to work with charities, nonprofits who can help you navigate that, know what to look for, have a network of consultants. So anyway, I think those are things to kind of, make sure that you have smart consultants. I know Kendra can help direct you in many places too, and advisors, because it's a big decision, and there are a series of things to look out for.
Definitely agree, Rodney. And I think the zoning thing, I was kind of naively like, oh, industrial land can be made into commercial land. It's not that big of a deal. Turns out it's a really big deal. And so these are the things to be conscious of as you go forward. I've also been interested to find, particularly with arts organizations that hold key pieces of land in key cities, developers are often very willing to go in on a memorandum of understanding in which they do that work up front, where they do the ESAs and the studies, and they look at the zoning and get all of that in motion to see what's possible. Just be aware, legalities of what you're agreeing to and what you're trading off later. Because if someone's putting in more money up front, you're trading something later. So you just want to get that on paper and with lawyers and make sure that you really understand what you're trading back and forth there, I think. On that front, are there some funding options to pay for feasibility studies, building inspections, any of this upfront work? I have some, but I'll let you guys talk first.
You probably know that landscape a lot better than I do, Kendra. I know CMHC actually has some funding that will do a pre-development feasibility plan and some of the work for rezoning application. But you probably know the grand landscape a lot better than I do, Kendra.
Jane, have
I
you
was
got
just
anything?
gonna, yeah, I was just gonna note like the city of Toronto has funding to support pre-development work as well as the community housing transformation center. Sometimes many of our members uh, get pre-development funding through them and through different streams that they operate, but as well as CMHC.
Are those mostly around housing, Jane?
Yes, they're all almost specifically for housing. Yeah,
Okay.
but sometimes, with mixed use developments, mixed use properties, you can curve some tails there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, if you have a relationship with your municipality and they agree to go in with you, there's money on feasibility studies that can be for housing, but also can be for retrofits of existing buildings. So, for instance, if you look at the larger city landscape around retrofits of office building into other things, office buildings to housing can often be very complicated. Office buildings to arts, slightly less complicated. So I think that there are opportunities that exist there that maybe we're not picking up yet off the table. Uh, Jane, how does the financing process differ when you're buying a property through a community land trust?
Um, like if a CLT is acquiring land, how does
Yeah,
the financing process different? Um, I think it would be like again, most of our case studies are with nonprofit housing providers, like CLTs that are providing housing. But I don't think that it would be any different than any other affordable housing provider or affordable space provider. Uh, we actually just developed a resource about how to work with financiers or financial institutions to acquire financing and funding. I think what is most notable and the biggest difference, and something I think people don't think about, is if you don't already have assets and you're kind of just coming in and you're a CLT or community driven, you have this kind of great grassroots space and this community support, you still kind of need to provide like a really strong business case to any kind of financial
yeah,
institution to receive any kind of traditional financing. We support and we, really encourage our members to work with values aligned institutions if they can. So that could be Alterna, that could be VCIB, Van City Investment Bank. I think it's VCIB. I only ever refer to it as the acronym, so I'm not sure. But all these organizations kind of have, success and have had relationships with CLCs kind of throughout the years. So they're often, able to understand the funding constraints of the CLT, kind of what the mission is, and they, see value in delivering a social good, and they kind of take that into account when, figuring out what they can do for you. But if you are working with more traditional banks to, get a mortgage, get a line of credit, I just really encourage everyone to have like a really strong business case and, work with a consultant, have everything set up, everything in place, and really be able to demonstrate what the money is going to be used for, how are you going to use it, and what you're going to do to pay them back.
fair enough. There seems to be an increase in cultural spaces sharing a building with housing, like GCTC, the new Tapestry Nightwood space at 877 Young. What are some considerations both of you would think about in regards to these projects, and what are advanced considerations of housing and cultural spaces together? Rodney, you'd mentioned a little bit on GCTC, but
Yeah, I mean, certainly about how you might share some of the common spaces, common amenities, how the revenue sharing model, not the revenue, but the cost sharing model, like in terms of roofs and the building envelope, shared mechanical systems. Do you have completely separate mechanical systems, or do you share one mechanical systems and you have a cost
yeah,
sharing piece? Parking is always one of these things. It's like, especially for urbans, that underground parking is really expensive, and who pays for it, who gets to use it, how does it get managed, who's down in the parking space. People in apartment buildings or condos sometimes get concerned if the public has access. So how do you navigate those things and manage those pieces? Those are all some of the considerations. I think there's like 1,000 different details to kind of work through on that kind of how does it get managed, how does it get run. But I think it's a beautiful model, really, at the end of the day, right? We need a lot more housing, we need a lot more arts, to combine those pieces together that help create more vibrant community neighborhoods. I think those are all, I think it's worth putting up with that kind of brain damage to figure it out. One other piece is that oftentimes, arts organizations like large flexible spaces without columns getting in the way of
Yeah.
view lines for performances and those kinds of things. And so that can create a very expensive model when you start thinking about how do you go up in a
Yes.
building and these very expensive things called transfer beams. So, you know, everyone going in being willing to be flexible and compromise and work through for kind of smart design, I think there are kind of really important considerations.
Yeah, I think Rodney touched on a lot of great points. Something we hear from our members is like noise considerations are big things. Often, like housing and cultural spaces have competing interests in terms of like, hours of activity. So we're working with a group now in Quebec, and they're trying to understand, what's going to be best for performance venues in urban centers and how that can work with a community of interest model. If we can do something to access housing funding through, performance venues being in a mixed use environment and including housing, but that's really difficult in terms of noise, truly. So I think that's something to really be aware of: noise laws, noise bylaws, etc. But that would be my only thing to add.
Thanks, Jane. Any other things you think, Jane and Rodney, that our group needs to know?
It's another big question. I guess I would say, dream big, and there's a lot of smart people out there who can help you navigate these waters, and make sure you have great advisement around you. And yeah, I think that given our time constraints, I think that would be
That's
my
fair.
takeaway.
Jane?
Yeah, I would just say, like, if you are thinking of starting a CLT and you think that might be the solution for your community and your context, like it is a great model and it fits a lot of context, but there's no kind of linear path. Like CLTs can look like a bunch of things. It's not super cookie cutter. So I would say, have great people advising you, really understand what you want from a CLT and what kind of the ideal output is for your project and your organization, and if it could work collaboratively. And yeah.
Amazing. And then, like everything, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So just pause and ask yourself, what is the thing that you're trading that you don't know that you're trading yet, right? So caution in all things is good. Caution and lawyers and advisors and due diligence and time. Thanks so much for joining us, you guys. I really appreciate this conversation today and you bringing your skill set to us. I know you're leaving our audience with curiosity and new things to explore and new ideas to think about and the ways in which they can be in control of some of their outcomes. We'll be offering 2 more modules in the winter and spring of 2025, including taking a deeper dive into cultural land trusts, as some of these are just growing now really in strength. And so we want to sort of understand how that landscape is changing. So we're doing that in late March. We'll also be chatting about developing your organizational governance in April. Guys, I don't know about you, but when people first started talking to me about governance, I was like, I don't know what we're talking about and why it matters. And now I've learned that if I ask myself, what is the thing that I want to have happen and what is the thing that I don't want to have happen, governance is the methodology to both of those things. So I encourage you to join us for that conversation. Lastly, this program's for you. We want to hear from you to ensure the content that we're sharing in these modules matches what you're looking for and it reflects the current arts funding and real estate landscape. We're asking you just to take 3 minutes to complete a survey that's getting popped into the chat there. And your input will be shared with the community anonymously and reflected in our program content. So the survey link's been added to the chat and it'll be included in the follow-up email if you've got a moment to just tell us what kinds of things you would like to learn about. If surveys aren't your thing, no problem. Just drop the ArtsBuild program manager, Eva, an email at program@artsbuildontario.ca. Sorry, programs, plural, because there's lots of programs at ArtsBuild. Programs at ArtsBuild Ontario, and they'll be glad to connect. You can follow ArtsBuild on social media and Eventbrite and subscribe to their newsletter to stay up to date about what's happening. And thanks for joining us for a fantastic conversation. And we can't wait to keep exploring. Thanks so much. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Jane.